Hello there. So, we're finally back to actual lectures. It feels like it's been forever since I've had to record you guys a lecture. But we're starting back up on Chapter 8 of the textbook, going over political parties and political campaigns. So before we get into the lecture, a few housekeeping, going over the test and everything that's come up in the last 2 weeks. For starters, since I've delayed recording these lectures until I finish your tests, I'm going to push the due dates back on your, it says Chapter 7 and Chapter 8. Chapter 8 and Chapter 9 quizzes, those will be due next Tuesday at midnight, not the normal Sunday. So you'll have a couple of extra days, since you probably won't watch this until Thursday at the earliest. And then you only have one actual day of class, so at school, and so I'm pushing it back to Tuesday. Hopefully you guys have plenty enough time to take the quizzes then. So last night was Super Tuesday. On the Republican side, no surprise, President Trump won all the Republican primaries that existed. However, the surprise was that former Vice President Biden won so many states that he was not expected to. The Democratic primary basically flipped on itself after South Carolina on Saturday, and so Vice President Biden won almost 50% of the vote in South Carolina, which forced all the other moderates besides Bloomberg to drop out of the race as well and put their backing behind the former vice president. So when Super Tuesday came yesterday, Biden was able to win. Let's see if I can think of them all. He got Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Texas. It looks like he's going to win. He won Alabama. He won Massachusetts, which was a surprise because that is Elizabeth Warren's home state, and she finished in third in her home state. He won Minnesota without ever visiting the state or spending any money or having any people on the ground for his campaign. He also won Oklahoma. And it looks like Bernie won his home state of Vermont. He won Colorado and Utah. And then it looks like Bernie will win California. We probably won't know the final delegate counts for California for another week or so, but it looks like he has won the most votes in California. So this basically makes the Democratic primary a two-candidate race now. Mayor Bloomberg dropped out of the race this morning, so that's technically still three people running, but Elizabeth Warren, then Tulsi Gabbard is also still running, but she's not viable anywhere. Elizabeth Warren is still running despite barely winning any delegates last night and losing her home state. So she'll at least stay in for another week probably and see what happens with her. But the Democratic candidates seem to be down to just Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. So we shall see. Got a lot more primaries left for the convention this summer to determine which one of those 70-plus-year-old men will be the Democratic candidate. Here is a link to New York Times' map. If you guys are interested, I thought about showing it to you guys, but I could talk about it fair enough. Okay, I want to go over your guys' essays. All of your essays have been graded. You should be able to go and look at all my comments and see how you got the grades that you got. But I wanted to talk about a few things that a lot of you guys got wrong that need to be corrected for the future. So first of which, you have to have in-text citations. Having a bibliography at the end does not count as citing a source. If you take information, even if you're paraphrasing it in your own words, you should put an in-text citation with it. Citations don't just go to directly quoting. You need to put citations of where you get your knowledge from. That it goes true for any essay you're writing, not just my essays. So a lot of you guys did very poorly on your research portion because you didn't include any in-text citations saying where you got the information from. You don't have to cite every single thing, but you need to at least put in there the basics of where you're getting stuff from. So definition-wise, I wanted to go over the easiest correct answers for this. You could have used the textbook definitions, and that's fine. But from what I want you guys to know is that civil liberties are inalienable rights protected from the government. Most of these are put into the Bill of Rights that are protections that the government cannot take these rights from you. They're inalienable, meaning that you're born with them and that no matter what, you have those rights. That differs between civil rights. Civil rights are rights that are given to individuals or groups of individuals by the government. You're not born with these rights. You're not born with the right to drive a car. You're not born with the right to vote, is the biggest one. The right to vote and the right to marry are not civil liberties, as your so many of those sources that you found said. I emailed you guys Thursday of last week telling you to not use that Find Law article that a lot of students had turned in with because it had bad information in it. And then a lot of you guys just went out and found the Swartz Legal, which is basically a copy and paste of the Find Law, also with wrong information. You guys need to find better sources. I'll talk about that in a second. So the right to vote. This is the quintessential civil right. This is why the civil rights movement was started in the first place in the 60s. Not everyone has the right to vote. If you are not a citizen, you can't vote. If you're under 18, you can't vote. If you're a felon in some states, you can't vote. There are restrictions on your civil right, of the civil right, the right to vote, that you don't automatically have. You do not have to be 18 to have the freedom of speech. You don't have to be a non-felon to have freedom of religion. Those cross the gambit. However, civil rights can be quartered off for certain parts of the population. That is why we had the civil rights movement, is because African Americans, and even in the 1920s, women did not have the right to vote. They had to fight to expand civil rights to other groups. Okay, the right to marry as well. Up until recently, if you wanted to get married, you had to be a man or a woman in most states. Before that, you had to be the same race to get married in several states until the laws were changed. The right to marry is a civil right. It is not blanketly given to everyone. Even still, you have to be a certain age to get married. Some states still require parental consent for minors. You still have to be in a couple. You can't be in a polygamous relationship and get married. Polygamy is still illegal, meaning that marriage in and of itself is not a liberty. It is a right given by the government. So I hope you guys can get this distinction down and better understand the differences between civil liberties and civil rights. I'll definitely try to hammer this down more in the lectures next year, because a lot of you guys missed this. Another problem that you guys had is a lot of you didn't follow the directions. A lot of you saw the prompt that asked you to pick an individual civil liberty or individual civil right. Even after I gave you a list of examples, you still discussed whether civil rights or civil liberties were more important. That's not what the prompt was asking. I was asking you to pick a civil liberty or a civil right. Are you for freedom of speech? Are you for the right to vote? And its importance in a democracy. So be sure to follow the directions next time too. something else that a lot of you guys came up with in your statements. Communism is not authoritarianism. They are not the same thing. Communism is a philosophy that got a lot of headway in the 1900s. That was then used for communist revolutions, and then those countries that had communist revolutions. We probably could have a whole class over this if this was a intro to political science class, and go over what happened in these countries. They had communist revolutions. They were supposed to create utopias, but in order to do that, they had to consolidate everything in the government before redistributing it. Well, after they consolidated it into the government didn't want to give it back out. So you ended up with authoritarians co-opting communism in and of itself. And that's how you get dictators like Mao and Stalin and Castro and Ho Chi Minh and other leaders that were a part of communist countries. That doesn't equate the two. Japan has a communist party that participates in elections every year. Communism is a philosophy on the same spectrum as conservatism in the United States. It is not authoritarianism. So I want to make sure you guys get that distinction. I don't want to see someone saying, without the freedom of speech, we'll just be a communist country, and then proceed to describe communism as a dictatorship. Different concepts. Another thing, on these essays, you have a week to turn them in. Do not email me 30 minutes before it's due asking for an extension. I'm not giving you an extension at that point. I'm not giving you an extension period unless you have a really good reason, like you're in the hospital and you physically can't write the essay. Those are understandable, but you have a week to do it. Don't wait till the last minute. Another thing, even though I have it due at 5 o'clock, if you email it to me before midnight, I will accept it. It is better to turn in a late paper for a possible late fee or late some deduction versus turning in half of a paper and getting hammered on being under the word count, not discussing everything, not having a bibliography. So finish it before you turn it in. Don't worry too much about the 5 o'clock deadline. If you're going to turn it in, I would rather you take an extra hour and email it to me. You'd get a better grade because of it. Another thing, if you're having trouble with Moodle, if you're having trouble with the prompt, email me with your TC email. Do not wait until you have class with your instructors at Pleasant Grove. You don't have time to wait, especially if you're waiting until after the due date to discuss it with them. I'm not going to give you an extension because you didn't turn it in. So, if you're having problems, get a hold of me. Get a hold of me early, too. Don't wait till the last minute. I might not be checking my emails at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're having a panic attack about the assignment. So, don't wait till the last minute. Get a hold of me if you're having problems. So I talked about this a little bit. The FindLaw, the Schwartz Legal, these are not reputable sources. Just Googling civil rights versus civil liberties and taking the sources on the first page of Google does not mean that they're reputable. Reputable means finding newspapers, books, well-known websites to get things from, not just aggregates either. I don't want to see Ballotpedia, Wikipedia, SparkNotes, and I really don't want to see Dictionary.com, and I don't want to see Webster's Dictionary. You have textbooks, you have other reputable sources to go to and get definitions of these things. I don't want a dictionary definition. And what I would really like is your definition in your own words, instead of just quoting the textbook and then not going into details about what it actually means. Everyone can copy and paste. I want to know what you're thinking and how you describe it, not how dictionary.com describes it. Basically, if it says pedia in the name, don't use it. If you're questioning whether or not a source is reputable, it's probably not that reputable. Don't use it. Okay. That's everything I wanted to talk about, I think. Remember to try and hit the word counts. I do check. If you're under the word count, you're going to get deducted because of that. And don't put filler paragraphs that repeat the same thing or just repeat the prompt in the essay. You need to hit the word count, but you need to hit the word count with actual work and not just filler. I've been where you are before. I know how to add filler to stuff and try and make things longer than it actually is. It's a lot better looking when it's all actual information and not filler, because it's really easy to notice when you're just cramming stuff in to hit the word count. Okay. Lecture on this is over. We're going to start talking about political parties. After we talk about this case, which touches on political parties. So I have 3 videos here for you guys to watch about single transferable votes or ranked choice voting. If you guys will take 5 minutes or so after you watch that and discuss your thoughts on it, whether you think the single transferable vote is a good idea or not. And then I would also like to see how this would impact party politics in the United States. So take like 5 minutes or so to discuss this in small groups after you watch it, and come back to the video after that. And just remember that these cases are going to be on the next exam, just like the other cases. So remember to actually watch the videos at the very least. Okay. I'll take a little bit so you guys can pause before I start the actual lecture. So party politics in the United States. First, we need to learn how are we going to define what a political party actually is. So a political party is a group or a coalition of people with similar interests that are putting candidates out in contention for public office and are going under a common label. If Black Lives Matters started running candidates as Black Lives Matters candidates, they would be a party, not just a social movement. What makes a political party different from other organizations is that they're running candidates, and it is that they're using that label as their candidates. The Tea Party is not a political party. Yes, they ran candidates, and for the most part, we would know if they were Tea Party or not, but they still ran as Republicans. So that does not make the Tea Party a political party. So when we have campaigns under these, they're always going to be party and candidate centered. Especially when we talk about presidential elections, those are going to be candidate centered a lot of the time. Trump in 2016 was very candidate centered, especially when it got to the general. So parties compete, but it's the individual candidates that are the ones coming up with the strategies. They're the ones that are making the issues important on the campaign trail, talking about them. And they're the ones that have the organizations under them. The actual national level political parties have very little actual structure. So the majority of the structure comes at the campaign organization level. So parties are in office usually, at least in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans are in office, and that's what connects citizens with the government. If you consider yourself a Democrat, that's your connection into the government, is you see Democrats in office, and vice versa with Republicans. In the United States, party politics and competition narrows choices down to two, usually, unless we're talking 96 with Ross Perot. But parties in the United States make it a lot easier to choose. You know what a Republican stands for the most part. You know what a Democrat stands for the most part. It provides information shortcuts and whittles down the competition to those key parties. So historically, the first parties in the United States were started between the rivalry of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton started the Federalist Party, while these were focused on strengthening the federal government and international commerce as well, versus, they stayed in office until 1800, and then Jefferson was elected and the Federalists went away. And then Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans, these were states' rights advocates, farmer party. The party split when James Monroe was president, and became what we now think of as the Democratic Party. They were the conservative party of the time, up until the Civil Rights era. Basically, the Democrats are the more conservative party. So Andrew Jackson comes in after Monroe, and he turns the Democrats into being a more grassroots party. He got small farmers to be more involved in voting. He was one of the first that had a big hubbub about the Electoral College and the House of Representatives, how it rigged the election against him to give the election to John Quincy Adams. When we talk about grassroots, these are parties that are organized at the local level. So you have local-based groups impacting it. So you think of grassroots like the Tea Party was, like Black Lives Matter, it's another grassroots organization. AARP, to an extent, they're an interest group that we'll talk about later. But if it has a small local base that builds up to the national level, you're seeing it as a grassroots organization. Jackson was the first president of the people. Really, he got, less rich white men to start voting more. Increased turnout by 4 times in that election as well. And this is because of Jackson. We saw new opposition emerge, and the Whig Party formed that didn't last very long, historically speaking at least. And the Republicans replaced the Whigs in 1860 with Abraham Lincoln. That was the election that caused the Civil War, because the South didn't want Lincoln as the president, despite the reason why Lincoln won was because of the fissure in the Democratic Party between the North and the South. What percentage of the popular vote would you think Lincoln got as now probably the most popular president in American history? He didn't get that much. He only got 40% of the popular vote, but he got 59% of the Electoral College. This is because, if you can see, there were 2 Democrats running. We had a Southern Democrat and a Northern Democrat that split the Democratic Party's votes. And then the Constitutional Union Party also split up those votes. If the Northern Democrats and the Southern or the Constitutional Union Party all stayed together, they would have had more sway at the popular level, and they would probably also push the electoral vote more, because these states up here probably would have stayed more Democratic as well. So because of party division, we got Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. Not to say that we wouldn't have had a Civil War coming soon anyway. The boiling point in American politics at the time were boiling over. So a Civil War was bound to happen with how politics were at the time. So as you can see here, here's a nice progression of the political parties in the United States. We've had several schisms in the Democratic Party, and only the one schism with the Bull Moose Party and Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s. We almost saw a fissure in the Republican Party in 2016. If Trump didn't win the nomination, we could have seen a split of the Republican Party. The Democratic Party is dealing with their own ideological barriers right now between the further left of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and moderates that are more Obama-Biden voters. So we've had realignment of the parties over history, but since the Civil War, the two parties we've had now have been consistently in control. Party realignments are very rare, and they're usually dramatic, extraordinary changes that have impacts on future elections. Major issues can cause party divides, such as slavery with the Democrats before the Civil War. Individual voters can dramatically change who they're voting for. Think of this in the Civil War era, or Civil Rights era, when the South started to switch to voting Republican at the presidential level after Barry Goldwater ran as a Republican that was against civil rights, versus the Democrats who passed civil rights in the first place. This dramatically changed individual partisan voting to where conservatives became the Republicans and Democrats became the liberals. There can be dramatic changes in the coalitions. This is one thing we talked about in 2016, of how President Trump was able to pick up blue-collar Rust Belt voters that were before then the backbone of the Democratic Party, where he was able to pick up Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin in 2016 by getting blue-collar white voters in his coalition, and versus the Democrats where they consistently had been before. 2018 we saw the blue-collar voters kind of coming back to the Democratic Party, so we'll see in November how well that holds, if it is going to be a true coalition change for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, where the Republican Party becomes the party of the blue-collar voters, versus Democrats who, at the same time as losing blue-collar voters, picked up white-collar, college-educated voters in 2016. These realignments are very rare. We hardly ever see them in American history. The Civil War was being the biggest one of these. In 1896, the Republicans solidified control. For decades, we didn't have a Democratic president until the Great Depression, when FDR took over. Woodrow Wilson was in that mix too, but he was the only Democrat, if I remember correctly, at the time, during World War I. And then 1968, as I talked about, after the Civil Rights era, the flipping of ideologies between the parties. There's a discussion about 2010. That was the Tea Party election, in which vast swaths of non-voters and evangelical voters came out in droves and push the Republican Party further right than it had been in 2008. And then we talked about 2016 and its possible changes. So the New Deal Democratic coalition is basically gone. The New Deal coalition, this is where the Democrats picked up blue-collar voters during the Depression, blue-collar white voters. The New Deal coalition was basically a combination of northern blue-collar voters and southern African Americans that were the foundation of the Democratic Party. Over the same time, we've seen that the Republican Party take control of the South. The South is heavily white Republican controlled, while African Americans are heavily Democratic, but still don't get state level elections usually. Prior to the change in civil rights, we saw state and local governments switching to the Republican Party prior to the federal level elections. Democrats consistently have been able to offset that by winning northern and western states after losing the South. This realignment is still taking a long time. We'll see if it holds true in 2020. But it has helped Republicans the most in gaining those blue-collar voters. Historically, we'd seen Democrats having more pledged people than Republicans saying that they are Democrats. Now both parties are pretty equal, with independents being the growing category of people abandoning both parties and declaring themselves independents. As we talked about, 2016 could be leading to realignment. So party ID is key when we're talking American politics. Most people vote straight ticket, and it's very rare for a incumbent or even a non-incumbent to get less than 80% of their party's vote. In 2020, Trump will hold 90+% of Republicans, or at least declare themselves Republicans when they vote. This is true for both parties. You rarely see people crossing the line to vote for the other party anymore. This is because we have heavy straight ticket voting now, where you go in and you vote straight Democrat, straight Republican for every possible position in the government that you can. We don't see a lot of split ticket voting. Split ticket is just voting Republican for one, voting Democrat for the other. This was very common in the South, of voting Republican and Democrat for different levels, because the conservative movement hadn't spread all the way across every level of government. So we only see about 20% of voters splitting their votes and not voting straight ticket. So we see here, 2012, we've seen consistently growing amount of straight ticket voting. 2012 was like 87% people voted straight ticket. So we've almost always had a two-party system. 1860 was a blip in having multiple major candidates. We either had the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, then the Whigs and the Democrats, then we had the Republicans and the Democrats. However, our two-party system is the exception to the rule, not the rule. Most countries have multi-party systems. multi-party just means 3 or more parties and that have capabilities to be elected. In the United States, we have plurality elections instead of ranked voting like we talked about in the case. So plurality means that you get 50 plus 1 and you win. Or in most cases, if you win the majority. So if you win 45% and the other person wins 40, then the 45% win. They don't need a majority most of the time. It's just who gets the most votes. This is called first past the post voting. If it is 50 plus 1, you would say first past the post. This heavily discourages smaller parties from forming and third parties from getting votes because of the idea that you're wasting your vote for a third party, because it doesn't matter. The two parties are going to be at the top, and the third parties are not going to get any real chance of winning. Another big form that many other countries use is proportional representation. So instead of us going out and voting for our local representative in Congress, you go out and vote for a party. So you go in and you would have a ballot that said Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Green, Democratic Socialist parties listed, and you would vote for that party. And however many votes, or the percentage of votes that that party got, is the percentage of seats that they get in the legislature. This has the downside of you not having local representation, but it is more democratic in the sense that you have a feeling, everyone has a feeling that they're helping and that their vote matters, because unless you're voting for a party that gets less than 5%, then you had a major impact and you got your party in office. This allows for minor parties. Like I said, if you're getting more than 5% of the vote, you're going to get a seat in most countries. So the whole point for most parties in the United States is to get people elected as candidates. You want to try and move to the center historically without losing your base. This has become less true in recent politics because of polarization. The parties are moving apart, so there's less of an ability to move to the center, because then you'll lose the majority of your party. This is what we call median voter theorem. You're trying to win the primary and then move back to the middle to get them to appease the most voters, so that you get the majority. Historically, the parties have been bell curves that overlap, and now that the bell curves have moved further out, there's less wiggle room for candidates. In multi-party systems, you see party coalitions form. This is when multiple right-wing parties will work together when they're in the legislature. In American politics, we would think of this more as just other organizations that help support the party. They're going to have overlapping interests as well, but not identical usually. Historically, we've had a gender gap in parties as well. This was not true in 2016. Trump won white women, barely, but he won white women. But historically, women are more likely to vote Democratic, especially when you're thinking of non-white women. And in the future, we'll see how much more the Hispanic vote becomes important, especially in states like Texas and California. So you can see here by different categories that we have. This is just voting Democratic, so it'd be the opposite voting Republican, basically. And 90% of African Americans are going to vote for the Democratic Party compared to just 42% of white. Younger people are more likely to vote Democratic. Jewish people are far more likely to vote Democratic versus Protestants and Catholics. And then the poor portions of the populace are more likely to vote Democratic. So there's multiple levels of party organizations. They're highly decentralized, usually the national level, the state level, and the local level. The local level is going to be far more impactful when it comes to elections. Parties, the main purpose is to contest elections and run candidates in as many elections as possible. Prior to having state-level primaries, the party organization used to be far more powerful. We used to not have primaries to decide who the candidate was. Everything was decided at the convention prior to having primaries and caucuses take place. This is where the nomination process usually occurs. Nowadays, most of the time we don't have a contested convention where no one gets a majority of delegates. We could see that in 2020 with the Democrats, but we'll just have to wait to see what happens there. But for the most part, a candidate gets the most votes in state primaries and caucuses, and the convention doesn't have to really concern itself with voting. Party bosses lost power when we had these primary votes. You couldn't as easily pick candidates. They couldn't be kingmakers anymore, with the public actually getting a say in primaries. And that's when we see candidates have more sway. We see more bigger personality candidates after this happens. Primaries don't occur in most other democracies because of proportional representation. The party has far more sway. You break away from the party, you're not going to get on the ballot. I'm not going to get into the legislature. So parties have more influence when it comes to politics in Europe. The party organization still has some power. They're still the ones putting on the debates. They're still organizing. Most important place that they're organizing is local level. This is where 95% of party activities and activism occurs. State organization, there is some impact at this by the state chairperson and the state committees of the parties. These usually focus on non-federal elections. And then the national has much less sway. They are beholden to the candidates, usually, whether that's the president at the time or the candidates running for office. But their biggest thing is they get to run the conventions every 4 years, which had more sway before primaries. They spend a lot of time raising money for the general fund for all candidates, but it's important to have top ticket presidential candidates that can bring in tons of money too, because then that can be redistributed down ballot to other less monetarily beneficial candidates. That's not candidates that have less funds. They're not getting as much funds. The Democratic Party or the Republican Party can step in and give them funds to maintain their elections. So here we can see is a quick map of the different primary structures by states. For the most part, these campaigns are candidate-based, as we've talked about. You have a personal organization around you, and there's a lot of personality-based. After the election, campaigns are disbanded a lot of the time. And you need a lot of money to be able to do this. Joe Biden has been very strange because he doesn't have a lot of money in the 2020 election so far. We'll see how much that changes since Bloomberg's endorsed him and can throw his billions of dollars behind him. So campaign costs have been rising over time. The average spending for a House or Senate candidate in 1980, or not average, this is all spending for all Senate and House candidates, not an average. That would be terrifying if that was an average of each one. In 1990, it was up to 400 million. 2016, it exceeded $2 billion in funds used on just elections for the Senate and the House, and that doesn't include the presidency, where, at least on the Democratic side, there's been over $1 billion spent just so far in the primaries. I mean, $500 million of that is Bloomberg, but still. So incumbents, people that are currently in office, have a much better time of fundraising. Name recognition really helps that. This kind of fundraising is called hard money. This is direct money given to the campaign versus soft money that is the money raised by the party. And we have PACs as well. More than $1 billion was spent just by PACs in 2016. So we have a lot of more consultants and data scientists and pollsters and campaigns now, campaign strategists, pollsters, media producers. There's a big push of having social media influence nowadays, and then a lot of fundraising experts, people that know where to get money and how to get money. So candidates always package themselves in certain key issues or parts of their lives that they want to focus on. Trump focused on how he was a billionaire businessman as a key component of helping him brand himself for the campaign. Joe Biden is branding himself as the everyman. You know, he's been in the fight, talking about his life struggles as well. So, for the most part, presidential campaign starts right after Election Day in the midterm. Trump is weird. He started campaigning less than a month after he was sworn in. He started campaigning again, and he's been consistently campaigning his whole time in office, holding rallies across the country. A lot of spending takes place on air, trying to get ad time on TV. This has moved towards having a lot of online advertising. As you guys know, you've probably seen a ton of Bernie Sanders and Bloomberg ads in recent weeks on YouTube and so forth. Ground wars, this is people getting on the ground, getting people knocking on doors, helping people get to the polls, busing people in that can't drive, so on and so forth. Web wars have become a bigger thing. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, social media influence has become more important. Biggest thing that impacts whether or not a candidate is going to get reelected is satisfaction with the current party. There's two ways of candidates voting. There's the prospective view, which looks at what a candidate is promising and what they can do for them in the future. And there's retrospective voting, which is what have you done for me lately? How is the current party handling things? Retrospective voting is by far the most common method of voting. As you can see here, most campaign spending goes towards media, with a big chunk going towards salaries of campaign employees. So as you can see here, the better the economy is growing, the better off a candidate is in winning re-election. You can see campaigns that didn't go well here. 1980 is when Carter lost to Reagan. Economy was shrinking. 1988, that is a little bit of an outlier because that was when Reagan left and Bush Sr. won, so the election stayed within that party. 2008, that's when Obama won over McCain, switching party control. Well, over here you have Bush getting reelected, Reagan getting reelected, Clinton getting reelected, Obama getting reelected. These two are strange. 2000 by itself is just strange in of itself. That's when Gore barely lost to Bush in the electoral election. And then 1992 is when Clinton beat Bush Sr. And so even though the economy was doing well, it still changed parties. This is probably, if you're a Trump supporter, this is probably what you're most pointing towards in hopes of Trump getting reelected, because I checked this morning, GDP growth right now is also around 2%, 2.5%. I highly doubt Trump gets 50% of the vote, though. So if he gets reelected, he'll probably be over here. Even if he loses, he'd be over here, just because of the percentages. So yeah, that is it for Chapter 8. I will see you guys in Chapter 9.